Record. Well, hi, Morley. It's good to see you again.
Steph, it's fun to be together. Absolutely. Looking forward to our exchange.
Oh my goodness. I have to say, your book came out at a really great time because the holidays are around the corner, and this makes a great stocking stuffer.
I love that phrase. You know, it's actually I'm seeing that several people have said that. I was like, well, I didn't design it that way, but I think it's actually true. It really does fit into a stocking. It's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's such a fun book to read. You are so witty, and I love all of the puns you make and the plays on words. And I've just thoroughly enjoyed reading this book.
Well, thank you. It was a labor of love.
Oh,
It
I
took
can imagine.
took almost 2 years from stem to stern, the easiest part is actually writing the book, but getting it into a physical format. Oh my gosh, the phrase I use now when I'm talking to people who say, "Oh, I want to write a book," I'll say, "You call me first, and I'll try to talk you out of it." It's just like, oh my gosh, but I'm so delighted to have it. And actually, the book that I think I might write next is "Cure Your Farm."
Mm.
I'm learning more about farming and regenerative farming, so that would be a rather bodacious thing for me to do because I don't know that much about it. But I think there's some basic principles that need to be shored up in farms across the world that I think would be kind of a fun book to put together.
Oh my goodness. Yes. I've heard you speak little snippets of, just for instance, I think you have an episode with somebody where you talk about how black cows need more copper. And that just blew my mind. And dark-haired people need more copper.
Exactly. Anyone with black hair, any animal, cat, dog, black Angus, black sheep, anyone with black hair. It's research from the 1960s. There was some university in Japan. I can't find the source research, but it's written up in several books by an Australian farmer named Pat Colby, Coleby. And she has books called Natural Goat Care, Natural Sheep Care, Natural Cattle Care, and Natural Horse Care. And she talks about this research in every one of her books. And they discovered that people with black hair need 6 times more copper than people who don't have black hair because of the melanin demand. To make things black, you got to have a lot of melanin, and melanin requires copper to work. And it's just amazing to think about all of the different animals on the planet that have black hair that may not be getting enough copper. And the part that I love the most is she talks about the black sheep. Every shepherd has a black sheep. You know, they have a flock of white sheep, but there's always one black sheep. And there's a very specific reason. The black sheep is the messenger. And the shepherd knows that if the black sheep starts to turn white, there's not enough copper in the soil, and he moves the animals to another pasture.
Wow.
And so now let's play with that. So every family has a black sheep. And that's very likely someone in the family who needs more copper and starts to act out. And nobody knew that what they needed was more energy because that's what copper brings to the party. And it totally revolutionizes our thinking about what does the black sheep of the family really mean? It's fascinating. So we put it in metabolic terms. Fantastic.
Oh my goodness. I can't wait to read that. You have my wheels turning. Well, today, so if you're just tuning in for the first time, I've interviewed Morley in a series on mineral metabolism. He gave us 3 different episodes, one on magnesium, one on copper, and one on iron. And I really encourage you to go listen to those episodes. Today, we're going to focus on his chapter 9 in this book, which is called To C and D, or Not to C and D. So I'm going to focus most of my questions on vitamin D, but I also have a couple questions on vitamin C, because those are the most commonly promoted supplements in functional medicine, and they're problematic.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just for the viewers, just so you know, two quick thoughts. One, I'm doing this conversation at the University of Florida. I met with one of my absolute research heroes, Jamie Collins. He's an amazing figure in human nutrition, and spent 2 hours with him and my wife, and it was just like I'm like a kid in a candy shop right now. And now getting a chance to talk with you about these topics is going to be a lot of fun. The second thing, I just want to circle back to the book. If you enjoyed the book, and I appreciate that you do, I want to put a shout out to my guest writer, Larry Trivieri. He picked up my voice. He picked up my sense of humor. I mean, I wrote stuff, but then about halfway into the book, he said, "You know, Morley, you're not the best writer." He said, "But I know what you're trying to say." And so he took over. But I'm honored to have that book be finished. But I really want people to know that it's not my work alone. And I'm very grateful for the hours and hours and hours that Larry put into it. And I'm very deeply appreciative of his gift of gab, because he's amazing. So just so everyone knows, who's on first and what's on second. So let the games begin. I can't wait for our Q&A now.
Yes. So, and I'll give props to Larry too, because it sounds like you're talking in this book. It feels, when I read it, I can hear your voice. And that's really
he picked
special.
up my voice. It's amazing. I don't know how he did it, but when I was going through the editing process, I'd say, "Oh, he missed this point," and I get to the next page, and there it was. It was that happened like 12 times. Wow. It was uncanny. So, no, I think it's a true and accurate reflection of my thinking. My writing started it, but Larry's writing refined it. So I think let's give credit where credit is due.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and one of the reasons that I really wanted to talk with you about this topic, I've listened to you talk about vitamin D on several other podcasts, and they're really technical podcasts. And I wanted to have an option for people that don't speak the technical language, that don't, that kind of just maybe have a basic understanding of health. So I'm gonna ask some pretty basic questions.
That's great.
So I want to just to start by defining what vitamin D is. In your book, Cure, you mentioned that vitamin D is a secosteroid hormone. And I want to know, what does that mean? And why is D more commonly referred to in society as a vitamin if it's actually a hormone?
Great question. And I think the true pronunciation, and again, one of the real thought leaders in this whole world, people may know of Dr. DeLuca at University of Wisconsin. He's a major figure in vitamin D research. But one of the people who's more approachable is a guy named Jim Stevenson Jr. He's actually a PhD in engineering, and his wife almost died from vitamin D supplementation. So he decided to become an expert. And he pronounces it secosteroid hormone D, just so you know. Yeah. And what that seco means is just as a particular structure, unique structure. But what's important for people to realize is this is one of the most powerful hormones in the human body. And what are hormones? They're just signaling molecules, and they get things done, as I think we can all attest to. But there's just rampant confusion because we are being conditioned and programmed to think that there's only two types of vitamin D. There's storage, or sometimes it's called circulating, and active. A lot of people don't even know that there is an active form, and we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, as we go along. But it turns out there's actually 17 different forms of this hormone. And I think your question is a fair one. Why do we call it a vitamin when in fact it's a hormone? And I've never been able to find anyone who could answer that question. It's again, the phrase that I use, or the reference that I use, is that the D in vitamin C really stands for deception. It's a very, a lot of the information about it has a veil of disinformation about it. People don't realize the layers and layers and layers of activity that are involved in this hormone. And there's this very childlike understanding that, oh, if I take the supplement, it's all going to become active and everything's going to be fine. And it's way more complicated than that. It's, it's like when we were little, we loved our birthdays, or we loved the holidays because we got lots of gifts, and we just figured that's the way life was going to be. And it's like, then we get older and we find out, wow, it's a little bit more complicated than we thought when we were in kindergarten. And I think that a lot of people are really in kindergarten as it relates to their understanding of this particular nutrient, because it's for a variety of reasons. Let me give you a couple. One is, we all drive cars, and we all know what the fuel gauge is on our dashboard. And we think that the fuel gauge on our car is like the vitamin D gauge. I'm high or I'm low. Well, high and low that's grade school arithmetic. High, low. Use a ruler for that, right? When in fact, it turns out that hormone D metabolism is more akin to miles per gallon, because that's an algebraic equation. The number that comes from miles per gallon is a function of variables, right? Mm-hmm. And so you can fill your car full of gas. You can pour car in the inside you can fill up the interior of the car with gas, and it's not going to improve your miles per gallon, because it's a function of tire pressure. It's a function of fuel efficiency, spark plug efficiency. There's a whole bunch of variables that are involved. Well, when the doctor or the practitioner says, you have low vitamin D, we're conditioned to think it's a ruler function. Oh, it's low, I need to fill it up. No, the variable to make vitamin D requires an enzyme and magnesium to make that enzyme work. And that enzyme is called 25-hydroxylase enzyme, or it's also called 25-hydroxyvitamin D. And that turns the precursor that comes from our diet, or it comes from the breakdown of cholesterol in our skin, it turns that precursor into what's called the circulating form of hormone D, or the storage form of hormone D. And that transaction is taking place in our liver. And so, very important transaction, and it requires magnesium, which is, as I'm sure we've discussed before, but I'm sure we'll discuss again today, is magnesium is easily lost to stress. So if your vitamin D is low, it means you're a stress cadet and your magnesium is too low, and your liver is taking it on the chin. So that's the first thing. And then the next step is to take that circulating form of hormone D, and it goes over to the kidney, and there's a second enzyme that's involved, and it's called 1,25-hydroxylase, or 1,25-hydroxyvitamin D. And what do those numbers refer to? It's the number of the carbon chain that's involved in making a change. It's becoming what's called hydroxylated. An OH group is being added to the chemical structure. Very important transactions. Again, 1,25-hydroxylase requires magnesium. Ding, ding, ding. And so if the kidney is under stress because you're under stress, then you're not going to have the same production of this active form of vitamin D. So that's the first thing, is that, first of all, let's understand that we're talking about algebra and not arithmetic. Second, there are enzymes involved, and both of those key enzymes require magnesium. And if the doctor says that your vitamin D is low, it means that your enzyme production is low. And it begs the question, why? Why is my 25-hydroxylase low? Third thing to point out is that people need to understand that what the doctor or the practitioner typically measures is the circulating form.
Right.
all hormones have a circulating form and an active form, or sometimes it's called a storage form and an active form. All hormones, whether we're talking about estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and these very powerful hormones called vitamin D. And at some point, we'll have a conversation about retinol, which also has hormone forms, and they're called retinoic acids. And they're incredibly important and incredibly powerful. So again, the issue is we're having only the circulating form that's measured. The doctor or the practitioner is not measuring the active form. It's the only hormone that they ignore the active state. And that should make people very nervous. And the reason why this is important is that there needs to be a ratio of circulating to active. Very, very important. And the active status, the number for the active status should be 1.5 times higher than the number for the circulating form. Now the units of measurement are different. In the circulating form, it's nanograms per deciliter. In the active, it's picograms per deciliter. So it's a different unit of measurement, but we key off the number. And the number for active should be 1.5 times the number for storage. Now, number 4, and I hope I'm keeping all this straight. I'm sure people, their heads are becoming poltergeists trying to keep track of all this. But, and again, I've had so many opportunities to discuss this. And again, I've been studying this now for 11 years.
Right.
This is not something I picked up yesterday. I've been actively researching and seeking to understand this for 11 years. And I'm glad I have, because it's a great source of confusion on this planet, as I know you understand. So the thing is, we've got these different states, and there's a very important principle that people need to understand, is that the active state of this hormone is level. It doesn't change. It's fixed in our body. Very rarely does it change. But the circulating form rises. Let me see if I get my finger in the camera. It rises and falls as the season goes. So that when there is sunlight, summertime, there's a higher production of the circulating form. And in the summer or in the wintertime, the circulating form drops. The active is steady, but the circulating form is fluctuating. Now, why is that? It's very important. It turns out, and one of the points that I've engaged in over the years is people always want to know what's new. Very, very important consultant to the natural health industry. His name is Michael Greenberg. He taught me to ask what's enduring. Don't focus on what's new, Morley. Focus on what's enduring. And that actually got me to look back in time to see, when did these hormones come on the planet? Well, it turns out that retinol is one of the first hormones on planet Earth. And we're talking a long time ago, billions of years ago. And retinol, real vitamin A, is a light sensor. Very important concept. It says, oh, wait, there's light? Then we can do something. Let's do something. Let's make some energy. Let's get some stuff done. So light sensor, very, very important. 700 million years later, a second hormone appears, hormone D. What is hormone D? It's a light filter. What?
Wow.
It blocks light? That's exactly what it does. And so hormone D is sunglasses. And that's why it's highest in the summer and lowest in the winter, because
Wow.
it's sunglasses. And so what is vitamin D called? Oh, it's the sunshine vitamin, right? Everybody knows it as the sunshine vitamin.
Sure.
But it's the exact opposite of what people think it is. It's, again, active, steady, nice and steady, doesn't change. Circulating is fluctuating with sunlight because it's a pair of sunglasses. And what it's doing is it's blocking the light as opposed to vitamin A, which is sensing the light and bringing the light into us, completely different function. And that's not taught on the internet. And that's not taught in doctor school. And it's just like, oh my gosh, it's so basic. And all people worry about is their number. Oh, my vitamin D is low, I need more. And they don't ask the question, why is it low? What's causing it to be low? And that's a very important thing for people to understand. Where is this circulating form of vitamin D made? It's made in the liver. Very important place of synthesis. And it requires magnesium, as we've discussed. Well, when people are struggling with their diet, when people are under chronic stress, as most of humanity is today, it does affect our minerals. We've talked about that. Some would say ad nauseum, but we've talked about it a lot. And we know it affects magnesium and it affects copper. Acute stress affects magnesium status. Chronic stress affects copper status. Why is that important? Well, when copper begins to be compromised in the body, it causes iron to rise in our tissue, especially in the liver. That's where iron gets stored, and that's where iron gets accumulated first and foremost in the human body, is in the liver. And when iron is rising in the liver, it has an impact on magnesium status in the liver. Causes it to go down. It causes a loss of magnesium when the liver is filling up with iron. Now, I want people to know that this concept of copper and iron has been very carefully studied for decades. One of the first studies that focused on this was done at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in 1928 by doctors Hart, Steenbach, Waddell, and Elvian. And what they did was they denied rodents copper in their diet, and then they studied to see what the impact was. And what they discovered was that there was a precipitous rise of iron in the liver of these rodents. One of the most important studies on the planet was done in 1928, and it talked about the important relationship between copper and iron. Very, very important relationship. Let's fast forward to 2021, almost 100 years later.
Yeah.
And two scientists named Lee and Gonzalez in March of this year took rodents, but they were able to study the 10 iron regulatory genes to see which genes changed in the face of copper deficiency. It's a very important study. So they got the rodents, denied them copper, and then they wanted to monitor what changes happened with the iron regulatory genes. And there was only one gene that changed. And it's called FTL. F is in Frank, T is in Tango, L is in Lima. And that's the gene for the ferritin light chain protein. It's also the gene that expresses most in the liver. And what does ferritin light chain do? It's an olein-free for iron accumulation in the liver. And what doctors Lee and Gonzalez were able to do was to prove genetically that Hart, Steenbach, Waddell, and Elvian were right almost 100 years ago. What it proves is that there is a relationship between copper deficiency, iron accumulation that causes magnesium loss. And that's a very important relationship for people to understand as it relates to hormone D metabolism.
Yeah.
Because if your liver is filling up with iron because you don't have enough bioavailable copper in your diet, and most earthlings do not have enough copper in their diet, by design. The farming system, the food processing system, and the pharmaceutical systems have been engineered now to lower copper availability in the diet. And that's causing a rise of iron in our tissue, which is causing a drop in vitamin D being synthesized in the liver because there's not enough magnesium. It's very, very simple. And so it's an absolute demonstration that the body has an elegance about it and has a very simple series of functions that need to take place that is not taught on the internet. It's taught within the magnesium advocacy group. It's taught within the Facebook page called Root Cause Protocol Facebook page, and it's taught in my course, the Root Cause Protocol Institute, but it's not mainstream internet pablum, and it's not taught in conventional doctor school or functional doctor school. They don't talk about any of this. And I think it's an absolute crime against humanity that they don't. And so it's important that people understand that there are sources of information around this that are not taught. And the story about low vitamin D and why it's called vitamin D is it's a great question, Steph, but it's shrouded in mystery. And for some reason, they decided to call these really powerful hormones, hormone D and hormone A or retinoic acid, have been, there's a bait and switch there in the terminology, which is just plain wrong. So I know that was a lot of new information for your listeners, but hopefully they can kind of follow the bouncing ball and it will make sense to them as they listen to this maybe 2 or 3 times.
Yeah. I find that that's what I end up doing with your podcast, Morley, is I listen to them multiple times because one time isn't enough. But what I would like to do, if you're okay, is I took some notes while you were talking, and I would just like to repeat a few things back to you to make sure that I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just want to reiterate and make sure I understand the difference between storage and or circulating vitamin D and active vitamin D. Right. So what I wrote down is circulating or storage vitamin D is made in the liver, and active is formed in the kidneys. Yeah, mostly in the kidneys. It turns out that it can be made in what's called extra-renal tissue. Okay. What that means is outside the kidney. Yeah. And macrophages, which are the Pac-Men that are keeping us healthy, have the ability to make active. And for folks who are really interested in this, there are articles that talk about this extra-renal production of active D. And I can send you some links that you could use for them to dig deeper if they're really interested in finding out, well, why does this happen and what's going on? Again, most people, the point that I think we need to really stress, and we'll come back to your questions, we base our opinions on a very important principle. We know what we know, but we don't know what we don't know. And most people don't have the curiosity to scratch the surface of what they know, to see, what don't I know? And what I chose to do about 11 years ago was to start scratching the surface of what I knew to find out what I didn't know. And you've heard the expression, the more you learn, the more you don't know. Yes. And I was absolutely amazed by what I didn't know. And every day, people need to understand that I research for 3 hours every day, 7 days a week, and I have for 11 years. And I've read about 7,000 articles in 11 years. That's more articles than 7,000 doctors that you know combined. They don't research the way I do. And I'm not here to beat my chest and say I'm, better than they are. I'm better read than they are. And I have by the grace of God, knock on wood, I have the ability to remember this information and to connect the dots between the articles that I read. So I'm honored and humbled to be in a position to answer these questions. But I want people to know that this is not my opinion.
This is a compendium of research that I've uncovered. And there's a difference between an opinion and my sharing of this information. So let's get back to your questions.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I love most about you is, you know, I left the hospital almost a year ago to this day. So I'm 1 year in on my research journey, and there's a lot that I don't know. And the more I read, the more I feel like I don't know. And in fact, I've gotten rid of my flagship 10-day liver detox program because I realized people didn't have the energy to detox. It wasn't working for them. And that was a humbling experience. So I'm definitely failing forward. I started out supplementing with vitamin D, and then I found your work and I was like, wait a second, you know, I'm blindly taking something because somebody else told me to. That's not a good reason to take something.
Right.
And it is a lot of work. And I think that's one of the reasons why I appreciate your book so much, because I know that probably 20 hours of reading articles that either were bad or, you know, like you read so many articles just to write 2 sentences, right? Of this book. You probably spent 40 hours to write 2 sentences.
There are a couple hundred citations in that book.
I noticed that.
Well, there are a couple thousand that couldn't get in the book. People would have been like, wait, this is too much information. You know what? You know, for the folks, I'm at the University of Florida, and I had a chance to meet one of my all-time research heroes. His name is Jamie Collins. He's a professor of human nutrition at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and he was telling me about this article that he had found this morning that had 700 footnotes. And I'm like, oh my God, that's insane. And I said, one of my other favorite articles is an article about iron. Just the one he was talking about was focusing on copper. And I told him about this article by Douglas Kell at the University of Manchester. It's from 2009. And the title is Iron Behaving Badly. Because most people think that iron can do no wrong. Yeah. And it has 2,400 footnotes.
Wow.
And Jamie's eyes went, 2,400, you gotta be kidding me. So I mean, it's amazing. The research is out there, folks.
Yeah.
But you just have to be patient and persistent to find it and to really understand it. So
one last thing I wanted to repeat back to you before I move on to my next question, because I know a lot of listeners get their vitamin D levels measured, and they're listening to this and they're thinking, what did I have actually measured? And the answer is probably that circulating or stored, that 25D is what they most likely had measured, not the active form.
Right. Absolutely right. And the article that really gets into the extra renal active D is by Meg Mangin, Mangin, from 2014.
Oh yeah, I read that one.
Okay.
You have that in your book.
Right. Very important article for people to read. Another very important article is from 2013. People need to know I'm from Baltimore. My nickname is Baltimorley. That was coined by one of my sons. And I'm a big fan of Johns Hopkins, you know, because it's a really cool research institution. But there's a Mohammed Amer, A-M-E-R, 2013, where he talks about the optimal circulating D levels in all-cause mortality. It's a very important study. And again, Stephanie, I'll make sure you have all these links.
Oh, okay. I'm writing them down just to look them up.
What people need to understand is that the lab range that's used by, you know, Quest or, you know, whoever the lab happens to be, LabCorp or whatever, was developed by Michael Hollick at Boston University. He's an MD, PhD. He's a big vitamin D guy. He's the guy that actually discovered the active form of the hormone. Never talks about it, but he discovered it. It's kind of interesting. But the range is based on his research, which means that circulating is supposed to be between 30 and 100. But according to Mohammed Amer, there's no clinical benefit based on all-cause mortality data to having the circulating D be above 21 nanograms per deciliter. And that's a mind-blowing number because most people are trying to get up to 80, try to get to 100,
Yeah.
and they have no idea what that's doing to their physiology because nobody talks about it. But there's a lot of research that people can tap into about this. And one thing, there was a last year about this time, it was actually, yeah, it wasn't, I think it was November, December of last year. We did a series of master classes that people can purchase. For those who really want to dive into this and get into the real nitty gritty, there's I think it's like a 1.5 hour class where I talk about all this detailed research with my colleague, Kristen Kershaw. She really runs the root cause protocol from Down Under. She's an amazing resource and colleague.
Can you send me a link to that too?
I can, absolutely. But people are going to need to pay for that. There's a paywall,
Right.
unfortunately.
Of course.
But I would definitely make that available. But it goes into all the research to challenge the pablum that's expressed on the internet. And people need to understand there's a difference between information on the internet and information that's available through the research. They're two different worlds. So I think that'd be a good resource for the skeptics out there that are saying, wait a minute, I've got to get my vitamin D up as high as I possibly can. It's like, no, you don't. And again, if the circulating is 21, that means that the active shouldn't be higher than 35. Steph, I've had clients whose active was over 100. That's insane. Absolutely insane. And it's a very rare practitioner who even knows to measure the active form of this metabolite. And
it's
that's
hard
a
to
real
get
tragedy.
it. I have a hard time finding a lab that'll do it.
Well, you can do it. You can do it through request a test. You can order it. People can order it themselves.
Request a test.
Request a test. But here's the catch. It's real expensive. It's like $10 to do the circulating level. It's like $100 to do the active level. And so practitioners don't do it because it's expensive. And then they love to play this card. I think it's so funny. They're always talking about the circulating and active levels of hormones left and right. And then they get to hormone D. And they say, well, the active form is it's so perishable, it's not worth measuring. Well, so is the active form of testosterone and the active form of estrogen and the active form of progesterone. Why are you singling out this one? And here's the catch. All other hormones require prescription, right? But we can go under our favorite CVS and Walgreens or wherever, Whole Foods, and we can buy boatloads of storage D over the counter.
Yeah.
And people don't realize the outrageous nature of that because we've been conditioned to think it's candy and that the more the better. I had one client in Buenos Aires, one sick puppy, whose doctor down there had him taking 250,000 units a day. And he almost blew up from it. And the doctor didn't understand why it was a problem. It's insane.
Well,
it's
okay.
out of control.
This leads me to my next question because I'm really glad you talked about it. So when you talk about supplemental D, you're talking about something that is fat soluble. So it's dangerous. In your book, you talk about nature's vitamin D, cholesterol sulfate, and what I learned from reading this chapter is that is water soluble.
Exactly.
Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. And that's the research of Stephanie Seneff. She's a brilliant scientist. I think she got her undergraduate degree in human nutrition, and then she got a PhD in engineering, I think from MIT. I mean, she's just like...
She's got 4 degrees from MIT.
Oh, does she? Okay. So she's just...
I'm a super fan.
Yeah, no, she's brilliant. And there's a conversation that took place, I think it was March of 2020, with Dr. Jason Dean, Stephanie Seneff, and me. And it was like, oh my God. Yeah, it's a great conversation. She's brilliant. but she did this wonderful article to explain the difference between fat-soluble and water-soluble hormone D. And it's very important for people to understand that the natural form, not the synthetic form, the natural form comes via sunshine. So you have synthetic and you have sunshine. They're completely different. And the synthetic form is fat-soluble, and it builds up in the tissue, and that's not a good thing. And the active form, or excuse me, the natural form is based on the work of sunshine kissing 7-dehydrocholesterol, I think it is, and that breaks it in, it turns it into the vitamin D precursor that then goes to the liver to become the circulating form, the 25-hydroxy. But it's very important for people to realize that just because it's in a supplement bottle doesn't mean it's safe. Again, the conditioning is just so deep, and people are like, yeah, but why is everybody taking it? Why is my doctor saying to do it? And it's like, because they don't know. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. And just because you and I are talking about things that your listeners don't know doesn't mean we're wrong. It just means that the listeners don't know what we know. It's just a difference of understanding. And I think what we're inviting people to do in this conversation is become more curious.
Yes.
Ask more questions. Scratch a little bit more at the surface of what's going on, and dig a little deeper to find out, is there more to the story? And that's really what the root cause protocol is all about. So it's having patience and persistence to keep digging to get to the truth of what's really going on.
You know, my aha moment I had with this Morley, when I got really sick, and like everybody else, I explored traditional medicine first, right? Got all the doctor's visits, all of these prescriptions. And I looked down and I'm 29 years old and I'm like, whoa, why am I taking all this stuff? Right. So then I go the functional medicine route, and I'm 31 years old, and I look down one morning and I'm like, whoa, I'm taking all these supplements. Hold the phone. I still don't feel better. What's going on? And that was my moment to be like, Steph, you weren't curious enough to ask what, like, your doctor maybe told you, this is good because it supports your immune system. Well, how does it support? Like, I didn't dive deeper than that. And that was kind of my awakening.
That's exactly right. No, what I've really have been focusing on in the last few years, and I've been inspired by Douglas Wallace, who's just this preeminent mitochondrial expert at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, or Brian Glancy, who's this incredible mitochondrial expert at NIH, and other scientists. Jamie Collins, he's an expert in metabolism here at University of Florida. Energy. There's hold up the book for just a second. I want people to know that everything I do is with intention. So the word cure, and we've surrounded the CU. Well, that's the symbol, the chemical symbol for copper, because copper is the cure. And cure your fatigue. Why fatigue? But I've got heart disease, or I've got cancer, or I've got arthritis. All diseases, all conditions, all symptoms begin with energy deficiency. That's the genius of Douglas Wallace at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania. Why is that book cover purple? Because the components of our cell that produce energy, it's called a power grid. That's the work of Brian Glancy. Don't call it an energy factory. It's a power grid inside the cell. Turns out these mitochondria in our body are purple. Why are they purple? Because the key complex inside the mitochondria is called complex 4, and it's called, the formal name is cytochrome C oxidase. What is cytochrome? That's Greek for cell color. It's a nutrient that has a color, and cytochrome C oxidase is where oxygen gets turned into 2 molecules of water. Most important transaction on planet Earth. Why is it important? Because that complex absorbs red light, but it emits blue light. And what do red and blue make? The color purple. Very, very important.
Wow.
And what people don't realize is we all at some point can remember our high school biology textbook. And we have that, some of us might remember what the picture of the cell looked like, this big circle, and it's got the nucleus in the center, like the nucleus runs the cell. It doesn't. And it turns out that picture of the cell had maybe one or two. A really aggressive textbook might have had 3 mitochondria. Guess what, folks? The average cell has 500 mitochondria. The average liver cell has 2,000 mitochondria. The average heart cell, 10,000 mitochondria. The average mature egg in a woman's body, right? 600,000 mitochondria. And there's a very important brain region that people may have heard of. It's called the substantia nigra. It's one of the most important brain centers because it's supposed to be really rich with copper. It has 990,000 neurons that are as long as my arm, 3 feet long.
Wow.
Try to get your head around this. There's 990,000 neurons. They're this long, okay? And you're sitting down, right?
Mm-hmm.
You got your seatbelt on? Each neuron has 2 million mitochondria. And when does Parkinson's disease become diagnosed? When 66% of the 990,000 neurons are no longer living. That's absolutely amazing. And these numbers that I share with you have taken me years and years to find.
Yeah.
And people don't understand that we have 40 quadrillion mitochondria in our body. And we've been taught to obsess over the 40 quadrillion pathogens that are out there. But no one's told us about the 40 quadrillion mitochondria that provide energy. And what does energy do? It keeps the pathogens at bay. They can't invade a well-energized body. And that's the basis of my whole work is ignore the enemies, let's ignite the energy. That's what this is all about. The root cause protocol is seeking to give people the roadmap about how to increase energy in their cells so they feel better. That's it.
Yeah.
It's a very simple model.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I really love your work because it resonates with me. I kind of came to on my own came to the conclusion that I feel like the root of all disease is a lack of energy to fight it.
Exactly.
And
Absolutely.
so, it's really interesting because for so long, when I went through my sickness, I like almost isolated myself. Like I lived in a bubble because I was afraid of exposing myself to stuff. Right. And then I had this moment where I was like, you know what? If I worked on strengthening the host, I could come in contact with these other things and I'll be okay. So I changed my process and I changed my perspective. And now I don't have food sensitivities. I can, do whatever I want. And I feel better than I ever have. So I think I'm a living example of that works.
No, I think it's very important for the listeners to know that there's a whole different paradigm. But let's pick at your vocabulary just a little bit.
Yeah.
You didn't have an illness. You were out of balance. You weren't broken. You were out of balance. There's a big difference. And if people have ever been on a boogie board, like you do, like if you're going to go skiing or anything, it's to try to stay in balance, right? It takes tremendous energy to stay in balance.
Yeah. And
if you go to one side or the other or the boogie board, it doesn't require any energy because you're out of balance. And so again, to stay in balance, to stay in metabolic balance, to stay in physiological homeostasis, if we want to use big fancy words, we got to be able to make energy.
Yeah.
Now, the other word to tease out a little bit is, and again, it's the conditioning of our society worldwide is to attack the guest. I had to attack, you made a reference to attack whatever was wrong with me.
Mm.
Well, when you lack energy, you invite in the pathogens. You invite in the toxins.
Believe that.
And so you don't need to attack anything. You need to increase your energy. And then all of those imbalances go away. It's so simple.
Mm.
It's almost too simple. And what I've learned over the years is that the people who are drawn to this work have high IQ. It's really, it's kind of cool. So you and your listeners, they've passed the IQ test because they're fascinated by this work. But here's the catch. People with high IQ have 2 genetic defects. We're control freaks, right? We love holding on to things.
Mm.
And we love complexity.
Mm.
And when you and I are talking about how simple this is, that is a real violation to people with high IQ. But when you get into the weeds of this and you really begin to understand what's laid out in the book and in the root cause protocol and in the 81 articles that I've got about iron toxicity and things like that, people are going to suddenly realize that there's a simplicity and an enormity to it that they've never known about. And that's what's really fun about this work, is to get people to realize that at the end of the day, what we need more magnesium, we need more bioavailable copper, and we need less iron.
Mm.
And once you begin to hone in on those minerals and you understand that vitamin D and vitamin A are not vitamins, they're hormones, and they need to be in balance too. And in fact, you need way more vitamin A than vitamin D. And the tragedy is no one's talking about retinol, real vitamin A, preformed vitamin A. And those that are telling people that, oh, be careful, you're going to become vitamin A toxic. Just like they've been telling us that we're going to become copper toxic.
Well, Morley, that's perfect, because that's my next question is, because we're talking about this idea of vitamin D in nature. From what I've read, it sounds like vitamin D is almost unanimously accompanied with vitamin A when it's in nature.
Right.
But when you take a supplement, it's typically just vitamin D alone, unless it's in like a multivitamin, when who knows what you're getting. And I wanted to ask you, like, what can you explain the relationship between vitamin A and vitamin D? Because to me, this was another big aha moment.
Yeah. Really important. People, again, the world of conventional nutrition and medicine is to focus on one nutrient. Mm. Well, Mother Nature does not work that way. Mother Nature is about yin and yang. Everything is frickin' frack, Laurel and Hardy. It's like it's teams of nutrients that are working together. And I'm blanking on the author's name, but it was an article from 2012 about vitamin A and vitamin D that just blew my mind. Again, I'll make sure you've got that. Because I think it's important for people to realize that you can't just focus on one side of the house. And that's the mistake that's made all the time. Let's focus on iron and ignore copper. Let's focus on calcium and ignore magnesium. Let's focus on hormone D and ignore vitamin A. It's like, and when you get into the sources of vitamin A and D that you're alluding to, the food sources, they're always together. And there's always more retinol than there is vitamin D. It's just, it's again, the ratio of vitamin A to vitamin D and cod liver oil, properly prepared cod liver oil, it's like 10 to 1. And we recommend a brand that's made by Rosita's, which we think is phenomenal. And that's the Atlantic cod has a ratio of 10 units of retinol to 1 unit of vitamin D, the circulating D. And then we also recommend a brand from Alaska. It's sold through Jigsaw Health, and it's an Alaskan cod It has 20 units of
Oh, wow.
vitamin A compared to 1 unit of vitamin D. So again, depending upon what dial you want to work up, but it's important for people to realize that these nutrients need to be in partnership and in relationship. And I think that the author's name it's like either Manson or Munson. I'll make sure you have it. But he does a beautiful job of explaining how the immune system requires both. And all we've been taught over the last 2 years, especially, is vitamin D runs the immune system and you must take bucketfuls and then you'll be okay. And it's like, that's not how it works. It doesn't work that way. And it's again, people don't realize that just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's factual.
Yeah.
You know what? People need to understand that there's way more to the story. And it's important to understand that we need both nutrients, particularly to run our immune system. And let me explain to the listeners why this is so important. And was taught to me by Jim Stevenson Jr. Again, his secosteroid hormone D group is very, very important. All of the attributes that people have been taught about hormone D are referring to the active form, not the circulating form. Active, not the circulating. Okay? Now, why is this important? Well, the active form needs to be attached to what's called the vitamin D receptor, VDR. People have probably heard that term. Well, VDR is magnesium dependent. Ding, ding, ding. That's it. All of the vitamin D metabolism is vitamin D dependent. It's kind of ridiculous, actually. And there's, I'll make sure you have the article that talks about that. Really, really important article. There's seven parts to the vitamin D metabolism that are magnesium dependent. But
Wow.
yeah, again, people just don't know that. But the thing that's real important is that, so again, we've got this active D hooks up with VDR, but there's a third component, and it's a nuclear receptor called RXR, retinoid X receptor. Retinoid is referring to retinol. So here's something that most people don't know. That sunlight has two really important, it stimulates two very important events in our body. Everybody knows that, oh, I need to make vitamin D by going out in the sun. And that's true, that's great. Very, very important. But there's another side to it. Sunshine stimulates the synthesis, or the breakdown, stimulates the breakdown of retinol into its component parts. And they're called retinoids. And for people who've studied languages, you know that you can conjugate a verb. And you got to be able to conjugate verbs in order to understand, what's the right context for this word that I'm using. Well, retinol breaks down into what are called retinoids, and it becomes retinoic acids, and there's 4 of them, and these are all hormones. There's 9 cis, 11 cis, and 13 cis retinoic acid, and there's something called all trans retinoic acid, ATRA. People have never even heard of that. These are incredibly powerful metabolites in the body. And then we have nuclear receptors. And there's RAR, retinoid A receptors. There's ROR, retinoid O receptors. There's RXR, retinoid X receptors. And there's RZR, Z receptors. Nothing happens if you don't have those nuclear receptors. And if active D is not hooked up with VDR and RXR, nothing happens. Now here's the catch. And this is the part that most people don't know about. The receptor in our intestine to absorb vitamin A and vitamin D is the same receptor, but it can't do both. It can't say, I'm going to bring in vitamin A and D. It can focus on A or it can focus on D, but it can't do them both. That's a pretty important thing to know. And if you start drowning yourself in a certain synthetic metabolite called synthetic D, you're going to overwhelm that receptor. All it's going to do is pick up hormone D. It's not going to pick up the retinol or the retinoic acid, or the retinol X receptors are not going to be available to activate this troika. Because if you don't have a troika, you don't have the immune system. The immune system is absolutely dependent on those three components working together. And as far as I know, Jim Stevenson Jr. is the only person who's really focusing on that and getting people to realize that there's just tremendous confusion around this, because everyone thinks it's the circulating form that's important. It's not. It's just sunglasses. And it's the active form that's steady state, but it's got to be married up with the VDR and RXR to make things happen. And that's a mind-blowing factoid for people who think they need more vitamin D.
And I love the way you explain that in your book. I feel like you lay that out. That was one of the things that was confusing to me listening to podcasts. It was kind of almost above my head, but I feel like in your book, you really broke it down into digestible pieces. And now I feel comfortable with that understanding.
Well, let me steal the analogy that Jim Stevenson Jr. has just come up with, which I think really helps people.
Okay.
To get this idea of circulating or storage versus active. Think of storage D as flour, and think of active D as bread. There's a difference between flour and bread. Do we eat flour or do we prefer to eat bread? Where are the nutrients? The nutrients are in the bread. I mean, there's nutrients in the flour, but it's not really in a bioavailable form because it doesn't have the egg, doesn't have the baking soda, it doesn't have the other nutrients that go into making bread. And so what he's doing now on his website, which I think is brilliant, he's saying, oh, you have a flour deficiency. And he's just messing with people's mind. But again, I want the listeners to really think about that. Flour versus bread. And our ancestors used to get by on bread and cheese. That's all they needed in their diet. They didn't have 7-Elevens every other block. They didn't have this smorgasbord of food that they can get at Whole Foods or at some supermarket. They grew their own. They milked their cows and whatever. I mean, they grew their own food. And we have this very pristine, sophisticated view of food now based on a century of alterations of what food availability is. But the important thing is, think of it in terms of flour versus bread. And what we really want is a steady state of bread in our diet that Mother Nature provides by being in the sunshine or eating foods that are kissed by sunshine. So what are some great sources of vitamin D? Well, eggs, free-range eggs. And what are the chicken's wings? They're little solar panels. So they soak up the sunlight to get the photons that they need in order to make vitamin D that goes into their eggs. Really cool. What's another form? Oh, bacon or pork products. And what's a pig? It's a bigger solar panel. Literally, the sides of the pig is a solar panel. And what's the biggest solar panel on the farm? It's called a cow. Big solar panels on the cow, and they soak up the rays, and that helps to infuse vitamin D in their milk, which is a good thing. But there's also tons of retinol in that milk, or at least there's supposed to be. Where is the retinol found? Oh, in butter and cheese products, things of that nature. And when you get into the the real deep research around animal husbandry, turns out that cows like to lick each other. And what are they licking? They're licking the vitamin D that's on the skin. It's just incredible. And it's just,
Wow, that's so cool.
it's absolutely amazing. And then the other source of vitamin D and retinol is fish. Because what do they eat? They eat phytoplankton
Yeah.
that are absorbing sunlight in the sea, and then the fish comes along and gobbles up the phytoplankton. So it works. It really does work. And our ancestors survived for millennia by eating these nutrient-dense foods, and we are being trained and programmed to think that we're supposed to live out of supplement bottles, and that's not the way it works.
You know, all of those foods you listed were once cut out of my diet to help me to feel better.
Sure.
And
I understand that.
since I decided not to follow those protocols because I wasn't feeling better, and I added eggs, organic cheese, and free range eggs into my diet all about the same time. And boy, I felt like instantly better.
Yeah, when I first started this work, and I was working with the Steph Centers of the world, and they were talking about all these different food sensitivities that they had, I was picturing them with a plate full of ice, thinking about, what are you eating? Where's your nutrition coming from? Because they couldn't have dairy, they couldn't have eggs, they couldn't have this, they couldn't have that. And I'm like, and that the tragedy of that is that people are being conditioned to think that that's okay. And that the way to get healthy is to eliminate this whole food group or that whole food group, not realizing that our ancestors didn't have this problem.
No.
Because the soil had more minerals in it. Therefore, the food, the produce, the grains, the animal products had more nutrients in it. And again, we just didn't realize how dumbed down we were through this process.
That's why I am so obsessed with Dr. Stephanie Seneff. I am obsessed with her work because she kind of meets that need in my education on soil health and glyphosate and all of that.
Yeah, no, and I think for the listeners to understand, her real key understanding is she knows that glyphosate, Roundup, that people are mindful of. She knows that it's a copper chelator.
Yeah, that's what it was introduced as. It was a pipe cleaner. Yeah. Oh,
it clears out minerals, and it has a particular affinity for copper. And for the viewers, they need to understand that if you want more energy, if you want fewer symptoms, let's put it this way: if you want fewer symptoms, you need more energy. And if you want more energy, you need to have more bioavailable copper in your mitochondria so that you can make more energy. It's that simple.
Okay, I have one last question for you on vitamin D, hormone D. I'm gonna start calling it hormone D again. I called it, I always struggle with that. I called it vitamin D because I wanted people to know what I was talking about. And if I said hormone D, people would be like, I don't know what that means. But I really love, you talk about the relationship between hormone D and ceruloplasmin in your book. And I did your full Monty panel. And so this is a personal, I guess, reference. I thought it was interesting. My vitamin D, it doesn't say whether it's stored or active. I'm assuming it's stored. It doesn't even say that on my test.
It should say 25 hydroxy is what they would typically label it as.
Yeah. And mine doesn't say anything. It just says D. And it's high. It's really high.
What's
115. And this was several months after I had stopped taking vitamin D. So it stuck around in my body.
It sticks around for 4 years.
Oh my God.
And fat soluble. And where I learned that is from Ray Peat. He's the only person who talks about the tail on fat soluble vitamins. And I'm very grateful to him for that. But it's going to take a while for that to work its way out. But again, as you work with the protocol and you ingest more retinol, especially from the Rosita's cod liver oil and other sources like range-free eggs and grass-fed butter and things like that, I think you're going to see it drop down. Now, what month of the year was that blood test done?
This was done in the summertime.
Okay, so again, it's disproportionately high because of summer. And you may have been outside more than you realized. So don't freak out. what you might want to do is go to request a test and look up the active D panel and get an update now that now we're in winter, we're starting winter, see where your circulating and your active D is, just so you have a sense of what's going on inside your body and get a sense of what that ratio is. Because I would bet that it's calmed down quite a bit just in the few months since you've had that other blood test done.
Well, and the reason that I bring this up is because I read, so in your book, you talk about how a high stored D can negatively impact ceruloplasmin, and my ceruloplasmin was just like a whisper below where it's supposed to be, but it was still on the low side. And I wondered if there was a relationship there.
But potentially there is. So what people need to understand is that here's a riddle for your listeners. We've been trained to believe that cholesterol causes heart disease.
Yes.
We all know that, right? This started back in September 24th, 1955. President Eisenhower had his first of 8 heart attacks. And so Ancel Keys changed the world by saying, we've got to take fat out of the diet. We've got to take cholesterol out of the diet. And we all believe that. For 65 years, we believe that. I mean, it's just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
People need to understand that cholesterol is one of the oldest molecules on planet Earth. It goes back, way back to the beginning of time. What is cholesterol? It's an oxygen sink. It takes 11 molecules of oxygen to make 1 molecule of cholesterol. And so when cholesterol is rising in the body, it means that, wow, the body is struggling with oxidative stress. And that's okay. It's just an indication. When did cholesterol really take off in humanity? When they started adding iron filings to our wheat flour. And that did happen in 1941. And in 1969, they increased it 50%. Those are factual events that are laid out in a book by Jim Moon called Iron, the Most Toxic Metal. He was an iron toxicologist. People don't know that. They don't know that iron is not good for you. And when you have excess iron in your diet, it suppresses copper in the body. That's the genius of Jamie Collins' research here at University of Florida. So again, we've got this rising cholesterol thing. And what people may not know is that the reason why going outside to build up sunlight, why that's so important is that when sunlight kisses our skin, it converts that cholesterol under our skin into the precursor for hormone D. That's a good thing. That's a great thing. But don't forget, it's also triggering the breakdown of retinol into the retinoic acids and the RXRs and all the nuclear receptors. And so it's very, very important that people understand that. And the key is getting people to realize that sunlight is our friend, and these metabolic pathways are our friend, but that cholesterol rising, maybe there's something going on that we don't know about. And cholesterol and ceruloplasmin are on a seesaw. And again, we're introducing a term, ceruloplasmin, which is a very important term. It's a copper protein. It's the master antioxidant protein in the human body. I say it's one of the most important proteins on planet Earth because it expresses 24 different enzyme functions in our body. Most people don't know that, and most practitioners don't know that. The word copper and ceruloplasmin are not typically used in doctor school, and so they don't know that ceruloplasmin is a very important balancing agent in our body because it's able to regulate iron status and oxygen status in the body. Turns out that iron and oxygen don't play well together. We know that. We know what rust is. We know what a rusty nail looks like, or a rusty pipe. But those are two very reactive elements on the planet. And Mother Nature's gift to us is ceruloplasmin that makes sure that they don't mess up. But if you don't know what ceruloplasmin is, well, then you really need to read the book, because that's what the book is about, is how to make more ceruloplasmin.
Yeah.
But the thing is, to get back to your question, there is a relationship between cholesterol and ceruloplasmin. And it's all about the bioavailability of copper. And if copper is not bioavailable, it can't be made into ceruloplasmin. And if copper is not bioavailable, it's going to make more cholesterol, which is going to potentially make more vitamin D. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. It's all
all
interconnected.
related. Exactly. And people need to realize that these metabolites are not one-off stories. They are interrelated. And one of the most important things for people to realize is that the focal point of human metabolism is the oxygen molecule. What's the state of oxygen in our body? We take it for granted. It's 20% of the air we breathe. But we don't think about the fact that it's also the second most reactive element on planet Earth. So the most reactive element is called fluorine or fluoride. Fluorine is the gas form of it. But that's the most reactive element. Second most reactive element is oxygen. Third most reactive element is ozone. Oh, gosh, I didn't know that. Maybe I shouldn't be pumping all that ozone into my body. I wouldn't if I didn't know my copper status. And so it's important for people to realize that oxygen needs to be very carefully regulated, and it needs to be broken down and turned into water properly inside the mitochondria. Because if that doesn't happen, it's going to become what's called reactive oxygen species. They're also called free radicals. Like, yeah, have as many as you want. They're free. Like, no, they're really toxic. They're really destructive elements. But the thing is, the body needs to keep this oxygen molecule in regulation. Needs to keep track of it. The body is designed via the mitochondria to turn this oxygen into energy. That's really what it's all about. Because you take oxygen, turn up the O2 molecule. O2 is a molecule. That's the oxygen molecule. But you turn that O2 into 2 molecules of water. So O2 becomes 2H2O, and it happens in complex 4 of the mitochondria. Very, very important transaction, as we've discussed. But the body needs to maintain that. And so that there are chemicals that are constantly sensing what's the status of oxygen. Our hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, noradrenaline, cortisol, all of these hormones are constantly monitoring what's the status of oxygen. Well, then the neurotransmitters are deeply involved in that as well. Dopamine and serotonin and melatonin, and people don't know that. They don't realize that noradrenaline is incredibly important, and it's helping to regulate the status of superoxide dismutase and other antioxidant enzymes. And so again, it's all about understanding who's at the center of the mechanism. And so the way I describe it is that the mitochondria are little water wheels. Again, they're creating water. And if that doesn't go well, they become Ferris wheels. Because if you're not making water, you're not making energy. And then you're not able to regulate iron. And what's the form of iron that's so destructive? It's called ferrous iron. And that little water wheel becomes a Ferris wheel. And that's when all the symptoms begin to fill up the seats of the Ferris wheel. And what are doctors taught to do? Treat the seats. And how do we spell the word seats? It's $, EAT, $, because that's where all the money is. And that's what doctors are taught, to treat the seats and ignore the copper iron dysregulation at the center of the Ferris wheel. And that's all we've done it within the RCP Institute, is get people to refocus their thinking and their action and make sure that the axle, which is spelled with the letter A, which means, oh, maybe the vitamin A is important, right?
Love
and,
it.
and get people to focus on the axle, and then the seats begin to get empty, and then the Ferris wheel turns back into a water wheel.
Mm.
It's pretty cool, actually.
I love your visuals. They always paint such a great, I can imagine that in the body when you speak.
Well, and I think it helps people to relate to it, because it's like,
Yeah.
we may not remember all the terminology, but we're going to remember the story, we're going to remember the images. And that's really what we want to do, is make sure that people realize that we don't get broken, we just get out of balance.
Yeah.
And we want, what the protocol is designed to do is bring people back into balance.
And I can say firsthand that it works, because I've been following the RCP since I met you, basically. So maybe, I don't remember maybe I met you in February. So several months, and like, I wish I would have known about it before. I wouldn't have to suffer.
Well,
but I'm also grateful for my suffering, because it makes me,
you
more
would never
empathetic to
appreciate
others.
it.
Yeah.
Exactly. You would not have appreciated it. And what you just said is so important. You are more empathetic now. You've been there, done that. You've one of my heroes is a client who's been to 100 different doctors.
Wow.
And I was able to heal her with the RCP.
Yeah.
I have another client who spent $250,000 on out-of-pocket expense, and cured her with the exact same protocol, the root cause protocol. And so what people need to understand is that even though you look different than I do, and our fingerprints are different. Your fingerprints don't look like my fingerprints, right?
Right.
But what's important is that your fingerprints and my fingerprints are made from the same protein called collagen. But the collagen expresses differently on your fingertip than it does on my fingertip. Your being expresses differently on your face than my face. But here's the catch. You and all your listeners and I all respond to excess oxygen and excess iron the exact same way. We all rust. And people don't realize that the aging process is a rusting process. And that from cradle to grave, we're adding iron to our frame every day. It's 1 milligram of iron every day. And that's the work of Robert Crichton, who's a world-renowned iron biologist in the Netherlands. And people don't know, but his textbook is used in all medical schools around the world. Very big name. And people need to know that iron is not our friend.
Yeah.
And in the world of homeopathy, this is a very important concept for people to understand. In the world of homeopathy, copper is referred to as the general, and iron is referred to as the foot soldier.
Interesting.
Very important distinction between a general and a foot soldier. And what we need is, here's the catch. We only need 100 milligrams of copper in our body to feel healthy. And what's going to blow everyone's mind is to find out that 100 milligrams fits on the head of a 1-inch stick pin. Not a lot of copper. And we have maybe 5,000 milligrams of iron in our body. But as we get older, that 5,000 becomes a multiple. So if you take my age, 69 times 365, you get a really big, scary number. And that's a lot of iron in my body. And so that's why I regularly do blood donations.
Yeah.
That's why I'm very faithful to the root cause protocol, because it's not just working on the iron side, it's trying to build up bioavailable copper, those generals, to keep track of all those foot soldiers. So.
I want to point something out to the listener. We've been talking for an hour and a half on just one part of one chapter of Morley's book.
Wow, that's a good point.
If you, I mean, and I say this in a loving way, Morley. I feel like I'm drinking out of a fire hose when we talk. You're just such a fountain of information. So I might save my vitamin C questions for another time because I feel like
That'd be
that's
great.
a lot. But I just wanted
Okay.
to say that because if this topic interests you, think about how much information is in this book when we just talked for an hour and a half on a handful of pages.
Well, that's a great perspective. I hadn't even thought about that, and you're absolutely right. I think hopefully we've given the listeners more grist for their mill.
Yeah,
That they have more to think about. They have more questions to ask. See
I
what
hope so.
what I encourage my followers to do is ask better questions of your practitioner, and secondly, demand better answers. Do not accept internet pablum for your answers. It's just not acceptable, especially in these really challenging times that we find ourselves in. There's a lot of deception out there, folks. And I think those of you who are on that cutting edge understand that. We don't need to talk about what that means. I think people understand what we're talking about. But the thing is, ask better questions, demand better answers. We'll do tremendous work to improve the awareness and intelligence that will help people get healthier and better going forward.
I have one last question for you, and
Sure.
it's a global question. And I've wanted to ask you this since I've gotten familiar with your work, because I'll preface this question by saying, when I was a student in school, anytime that I used citations, anytime I did a PowerPoint presentation or wrote a research paper, I was only allowed to use current research. And I think that that's problematic. Okay, so you see where I'm going with this.
Oh, yeah.
So the
Absolutely.
research could only be 7 to 10 years old. And so I had ingrained in my brain at a young age that any research that's older is not good, is not maybe valid, or is problematic. But as I'm getting older and I'm going through the process of unlearning, I feel like I spend more time unlearning what I used to think I knew than I do maybe learning new information sometimes. I find that I'm more attracted to older research. And I think that's, again, one of the reasons why I really love your work, because you talk about a lot of older research. And so I just wanted to pick your brain to see if you what you find the biggest difference to be between studies conducted in the early 1900s versus today when it comes to the topics that you research.
No, it's great. Wonderful question. Yeah, and I'm a student of the history, and I love looking back. Again, Michael Greenberg saying, "What's enduring? Look back, find out what the greats were saying." The difference between the more enduring research versus the contemporary research, back in the day, they were really seeking to understand, how does the human body work? What makes it tick? Where does energy come from? The research today is, how can I make a buck?
That's the impression I got too.
Where's the commercial opportunity? And I'm embarrassed at the number of researchers that are obsessed with finding some new drug that, like, that's not what this is about. So let me give the listeners a mind-blowing peek at what you're talking about. Many of your listeners have probably heard of a guy named Otto Warburg. He's a very famous MD, PhD, born in the late 1800s, died in 1970. And when he was growing up, his father was a famous physicist, and his two best friends were a guy named Albert Einstein and Max Planck. And Albert Einstein and Max Planck, world-renowned scientists of their own right, of course. His father was Emil Warburg, but Einstein and Planck would come over to play music. Einstein played the violin, and Planck was a piano player. And they would come over to entertain the Warburg family. It's like, can you imagine growing up with that? You know, it's like pretty heady stuff, right? So you've got Otto Warburg, this incredibly gifted scientist. It's almost like preordained. The guy's just absolutely brilliant. He was only nominated 47 times for a Nobel Prize.
Only.
47 only 47 times. And he's the guy that in 1931 was given a Nobel Prize, was awarded the Nobel Prize for discovering complex 4. And there's a classification system for enzymes. It's called enzyme classification. So the complex 4 is EC, enzyme classification 1.9.3.1. And the reason why I remember that is he got his award in 1931, 1.9.3.1. So, all right, so here's this incredibly talented guy. He really starts his research, his big research was after the First World War. So 1919. And he's obsessed with how oxygen gets metabolized inside the cell, especially inside the mitochondria. He's all over it. He's on it. He's studying sea urchin eggs. He knows that these eggs are massively infested with mitochondria. But he's also fascinated with cancer, as were many people back in that era of the 19 teens and 1920s. They were really preoccupied with cancer research because it was very prevalent in Europe. It was becoming a serious problem. 1926, Otto Warburg gets nominated for a Nobel Prize for his, at that time, pioneering research about cancer metabolism and how under cancer metabolism, there's an increased breakdown of glucose, but it's done anaerobically. And even though oxygen is present in the cell and in the mitochondria are breaking down the oxygen through fermentation. And that's called the Warburg effect. And the reason why they're doing that is because there's no bioavailable copper. Now, Warburg doesn't talk about that in the detail that I think he should, but in any event, 1926, he gets nominated for a Nobel Prize. But there's a second person who's nominated, and his name is Johannes Fibinger, Fibinger, and he's a Dutch researcher. And he discovered that rodents that ate cockroaches that had worms inside them also got cancer. A completely different paradigm of causing cancer. Warburg's approaching it metabolically. Fibinger is approaching it with pathogens.
Yeah.
There must be something, some worm, some parasite or something inside that cockroach caused the breakdown that we know as cancer today. And they give the Nobel Prize to Fibinger. 1926 Nobel was actually awarded in 1927. There's all sorts of reasons why, but in any event, it's the 1926 Nobel awarded in 1927 to Johannes Fibinger, and Warburg is pissed because he knows he's right. Now here's where it's going to blow your listeners' minds. Fibinger keeps chipping away at it and realizes what's really in play. And what Dr. Fibinger discovers is that retinol deficiency, the deficiency of real vitamin A, the deficiency of retinoic acids, the deficiency of retinoid receptors is in fact the cause of cancer. And he discovered this in the late 1920s. He dies in 1928. About a year after he gets the Nobel Prize, in the 2 years between 26 and 28, he makes these findings. There's publications, and there's even people, there's contemporary scientists who are chasing this issue. And for the listener, if you're at all worried about getting cancer, because it might have existed in your family. First of all, it's not genetic. That's a complete and utter farce. But this retinol thingy, this vitamin A thingy is really, really important. And I would never have learned that had I not understood the historical context of Otto Warburg. Let me explain where I found out about this. An in vivo moment for your followers. I'm reading this amazing book. If I can get it up. It's called Ravenous by Sam Apple is the author. Sorry for the movement. Sam Apple. Ravenous. It's a story about Otto Warburg. Why ravenous? Because cancer cells are ravenous for glucose. And Warburg understood why. But what he doesn't do, to my satisfaction, is explain why glucose and why fermentation. Because the mitochondria have lost their supply of bioavailable copper to run the mitochondrial complexes that are allowing for the activation of oxygen, the activation of hydrogen to create water to allow natural respiration to occur and make energy. So the difference is, just so people have a context, if you burn fat in a mitochondria, you get 140 miles per gallon. If you burn sugar in a mitochondria, you get about 34 miles per gallon. If you ferment sugar anaerobically, which is what cancer cells do, 2 miles per gallon. Big difference. And that's why they need to proliferate. And guess what retinol does? It puts the brakes on proliferation.
Wow.
And what people don't understand is the importance of retinol in a world that is dominated by dementia, because people think all they need is hormone D and they're going to be okay and safe. And I'll put good money that a decade from now, because of what has happened over the last 2 years, we're going to see a precipitous rise of cancer. Why? Because excess vitamin D blocks the absorption of retinol, which means that cancer metabolism is going to take off, but it takes time for that process to take place. Nobody's talking about that. I've never said that publicly until today, Steph. So you're on the cutting edge, and I'm sure that there are some listeners right now who are fritzing out.
Yeah.
You can't believe that this is possible. And again, I come back to our opening volley. We know what we know.
Yes.
But we don't know what we don't know. And I didn't know a lot of this until I started to read this book. And Sam Apple has changed my world because he's introduced to me to not just Otto Warburg at a level that I find fascinating, but he introduced me to Johannes Fibinger, who I didn't know anything about. And Fibinger understood that cancer is caused by a lack of retinol. And your more aggressive followers, when they get into the research, they're going to find out he's right. And that retinol to this day is being used to cure cancer, but it's being done quietly because it kills the message of the field of oncology.
Yeah. Somebody else that I follow is Dr. Zach Bush, and that was his research before he does what he does now. He was studying vitamin A in the treatment of cancer.
I didn't know that about Dr. Bush. That's amazing. Well, good, good on him. Glad he was doing that. And why? Maybe we can close with this as a focal point. I think there's 2 axes in the body. Copper, retinol, and oxygen. And they work intimately to create energy. because it's actually retinol is critical. The retinoic acids are critical to activate what are called copper pumps to enable copper enzymes to exist. And if these copper enzymes, like cytochrome C oxidase inside our mitochondria, don't exist, then we can't consume oxygen, we can't activate oxygen, we can't turn it into water to release energy. So that's one axis: copper, retinol, and oxygen. The other axis is iron, hormone D, and nitric oxide. Completely different paradigm of interaction. And hormone D, again, we don't have the chance, we won't have the benefit because we're running out of time now, but hormone D causes iron to get stored deeper in the tissue. And that's not a good thing. And nitric oxide, when iron is building in the tissue, availability of copper is falling. And as soon as copper starts to fall, oxygen can't be consumed properly, and nitric oxide gets produced inside the mitochondria. Like that. It's axiomatic. It's the way our mitochondria are designed. And nitrogen has been on the planet a lot longer than oxygen. 80% of the air we breathe, folks, is nitrogen. And the body flips on a dime. As soon as copper starts to get a little wobbly in the body, nitric oxide starts getting produced. And people don't realize what that means. Well, it means that you can't make energy. And what are you going to make? You're going to make heat. You're going to make what's called hydrogen peroxide. You're going to make inflammation. You're not going to make energy. It's a completely different dynamic. And the average person doesn't know about that. But that's the difference between retinol and hormone D. Wow. They have a completely different paradigm of interaction. And I truly believe that the retinol, again, the light sensor, very important function inside the body, light sensor. And I read an article on plant physiology the other day that absolutely blew my mind. And I'll leave you with this thought. Copper, again, we're in the world of plants, and copper needs to be in the soil, as Stephanie Seneff has taught us. Copper that is not exposed to sunlight becomes hypoxic. Now think about what that means.
Wow.
It means that copper is at the nexus of this whole idea of respiration. Copper that is not exposed to sunlight becomes hypoxic. Folks, that's a mind-blowing sentence.
That is mind-blowing.
And what we've not been taught properly on the internet is how essential bioavailable copper is to enable our mitochondria to function, to respire, to consume oxygen, to make sure that hydrogens are being pumped to create the membrane potential, to make sure that magnesium ATP is actually getting made in complex 5. And that's all on the back of bioavailable copper. And what's essential to do that is retinol. And the more synthetic D you have in your supplement routine, the less available the retinol, the less bioavailable your copper, and the more reactive and rogue your iron. And then you're going to lose magnesium. And guess what's going to happen? The doctor's going to say, oh, you've got low vitamin D. But now you know why. And the challenge is on your back now to begin to challenge what you do know with what Steph and I have been talking about and say, wow, there seems to be way more to this story. And again, get back to asking better questions and demanding better answers.
Well, all right, listeners, if your brain hurts, you are not alone. Because mine does too. Oh, goodness.
I hope this banter makes sense. I
It
really hope that
does.
it helps people begin to connect the dots.
Everything you've said is so beautifully put. I took several pages of notes so that I can outline some show notes for listeners, so they know exactly what we're talking about. And of course, I'll put links to
And I'll get you a series of
everything
articles for you to put in there.
in the show notes.
Yeah, there'll be about 4 or 5, maybe 6 articles that I can forward to you, just to give people a very different perspective of the story about hormone D. People don't realize that we have been corralled into a way of thinking. And again, go back to when we were little. Our mom would give us a choice between a red shirt and a blue shirt. And we felt so empowered. Oh, I want the red shirt today, right? And what they did, starting a couple of years ago, they said, either take hormone D or die. And people didn't realize what they were doing. They were corralling us into a mindset, a decision-making mindset, but we weren't being given all of the information. Yeah. We didn't have a full spectrum of knowledge to be able to make an informed decision about what was really going on. So I really invite the listeners to just ease up. And the famous saying, the mind is like a parachute. It works best when it's open. And just keep an open mind. Just really approach this discussion that we've had today. Listen to it a couple of times, and then start doing some of the research with the information that Steph's going to make available. And I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised with the results of your inquiry. I think you're going to really begin to see shifts in thinking that need to take place.
Well, thank you again, Morley Robbins. It's always a pleasure to have you. I've just learned so much from you, and I'm just so grateful that our paths crossed.
Well, me too. And then what we need to do is reserve a date to talk about real vitamin C and ascorbic acid. That would be a fun conversation. And then what we can do is, after we've had those 2 conversations, I have a feeling you might have some questions to answer within your community, and we can do a Q&A.
Oh, that'd be so fun.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Because I know people are going to have questions. They're going to have concerns. They're going to parrot back a lot of the research that's bannered about on the internet, and people don't realize that it's a very narrow set mindset, and that a lot of the results that they're seeing in the research about vitamin D is about vitamin D suppressing the immune system. Well, there's a difference between suppressing an immune system and downregulating it, which is what vitamin A does. Mm-hmm. Vitamin A downregulates; it doesn't suppress. And those are 2 completely different concepts, and maybe we can talk about that further in a subsequent conversation.
Yeah, I would love that.